Forms are extremely important parts of a website, and there are a lot of things that you can do to make your form look better and style it in a more compelling way. In the next few exercises, we're going to look at some small things that you can do to really enhance your forms. In this exercise, we're going to be looking at the Focus Selector. What that means is that we're going to add some special styles to our form so that when the form elements are in focus, they change and look different from the default behavior. If we look at the same page without any styling on it, you can see when I click in the form element, I get a blue outline around the input field. This does not always go with the rest of the elements on the web page. So by using some CSS, you can style this and make it look much more professional and also have it match the rest of the design on your page. In another movie, we're going to talk about how we can take regular old checkboxes and style them in a way that is much more compelling. So you can see my checkboxes actually become these on and off sliders. But like I mentioned, we'll look at that in another movie. For this one, we're going to focus on enhancing a form by modifying the focus state. Here's what the page looks like from the starting point. By the end of this exercise, our page is going to look like this, and you can see that my input fields now have a more dynamic state, and they're also styled so that they go with the rest of the page in a more compelling manner. Let's get started with this exercise. The HTML that I'm starting with contains a main tag that wraps around every single element that's on my page. Then I have a header tag with an image and an H1. Then I have a section tag that contains an article, and the article wraps around all of the other content that's on the page. Within the article, I have an H1 and a paragraph, and then I have my form tag. My form tag is going to contain several divs. These are going to represent the various columns that I'm using. So the first div is going to contain my input and text fields, and then the second div is going to contain our checkboxes. We'll be focusing on the div that contains our input fields. The way I've set up my form is I have label tags, and the label tags wrap around some text that is the label for this particular element. They all contain a break tag, and then they're followed by the input tag. The last label tag has a text area rather than an input field. And as you can see, this is what my page looks like in the browser so far. Let's go into our CSS, and let's begin by styling the CSS for the form elements. I've created a comment down here that is going to be the location where I put all my styles for my form elements. I'm just going to hit a couple more returns to push this up a little bit higher on my screen. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make a rule that is going to separate the area that asks for the name, email, and questions from the area that asks you to select a mustache type. I'm going to do that by using the hook of my .form column. We're going to begin by setting the width to 100%. Then we'll set a margin bottom of 0.5 ems, and I'm going to add a border bottom. And on the border bottom, we'll use a dotted line. It's going to be 1 pixel, and the colors that I'm going to use are going to be an RGB color that is 121, 152, and 136. If we save now and refresh in the browser, you can see that I have a small separator in between the various sections of my form. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to get our labels to appear stacked on top of the input and text area fields. Let's make a rule for our labels. And for our labels, we're going to use display block. I'm going to set some margin settings. We'll have the cursor display as the pointer, and we're going to set our font size to 1em. I'll save my page, and if we refresh in the browser, you can now see that the labels are stacked on top of the input and text area fields. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create some styles for both the input and the text area fields. Let's go ahead and use form input. I'm going to set some padding settings. I'm going to set a color of white for the text. Our font size is going to be slightly smaller. We'll use 0.9 ems. We'll set the background colors on the input fields to use a 50% version of the green that we're using. So let's actually use the RGBA, and then I'm going to plug in the values: 121 for red, 152 for green, and 136 for blue. And then we'll use 0.5 so we can have this display with 50% opacity. If we refresh now, you can see that the input fields now have this green background color, and they have some padding around them. Now when I click inside them, they are getting a focus of yellow. Now as you can see, the text is not changing to a white color. The reason why is because this is actually placeholder text. In order for us to change the color of the placeholder text, like you can see if I start typing, my typed text is white. The placeholder text, however, though, is going to be gray. If for some reason you want to affect the placeholder text, then you would need to make a rule for the placeholder text, and you do that by using the pseudo class of input placeholder. If we set the input placeholder, and we're going to go ahead and use our RGBA green color, and let's just set this to 80%. Now if we save and we refresh, you can see that there is no difference. The reason why is because placeholder is one of our CSS3 pseudo elements. So in order to take advantage of the CSS3 pseudo elements, we have to use double colon. So if I change this to double colon and we refresh, you can now see that the color for the placeholder is set to green. And if I begin to type, my typed color is now going to be white. The purpose of the double colon is that it was introduced to establish the difference between pseudo classes. Pseudo classes are things like hover, visited, things that existed in CSS2 with the new pseudo elements. Some of the browsers do not support the new pseudo elements, so just keep that in mind. And this isn't really a deal breaker, because if this doesn't work, the text is simply going to be gray until we click in it. I did want to mention though that sometimes you might see people using the single colon, and sometimes you might see people using the double colon. Remember, pseudo elements use single colons in CSS2 and double colons in CSS3. Now that I've rendered my change to the input field, you can see that no change has been updated on the text area, and that's because it's a separate field. We'll just go ahead and use a group selector here and add text area onto our selector, and we might as well do the same thing over here for our placeholder. So I'm going to put a comma in here, and we'll just change input to text area. If we save now and refresh, you can see that all of these changes are taking place in both the input fields and the text area field. The other thing that I want to do here is I want to get rid of this outline or the border. By default, input fields kind of have a beveled border where they're going to be darker on the left and the top and lighter on the right and the bottom. And then text fields don't have that at all. They just have a uniform border. So we want to make all of these things look exactly the same. I'm going to do that by coming up to the rule that we've already specified for input and text area fields, and we're going to change the border to none. I'm also going to change the border radius. Since my design kind of uses some rounded corners, I'll make my input fields have a slight rounded corner as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to also specify that I want the outline to be none as well. Now, to customize the look of these input fields, when focus is present, we're going to change the background color, and we're also going to give these a border color. So I'm going to make another selector, and we'll go ahead and I'm just going to copy my form input and form text area selectors, and we're going to go ahead and add the pseudo class of focus. So after both text area and input field, I'll add the focus. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to add a border color. And for the border color, we're going to use our RGBA color, and I'm going to put in my green color that we're using elsewhere on our site, and we're going to use 100% opacity for that. I'm also going to change the background color, and the background color is going to go to a 60% color of white. So again, if I want to do that, I'm going to have to use my RGBA selector. If we save now and we refresh, you can see that when I click in these, they're going to become selected. Now, because I only used border color, I'm not getting the border. The border is not showing up. That's because I turned the border off up here. We can add the border back in. So if I got rid of the color here and I added the border back in, I'll make it solid and 1 pixel and keep that same color green. And we refresh and we look at this in the browser, you can see that there's kind of like a little bit of a jump when I click into each of my fields. And that's because presently the outline or the border does not exist. And then when I click in them, the border is added on. It's going to cause the text that is serving as the label to kind of move up and down. I don't want that happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our form input form area, and we're going to add a border. So once we remove the border, now we're going to add the border back in, and I'm going to tell the border to have a 0% opacity. It doesn't really matter what color we use on the border because it's going to be invisible. Then I'll go back to my focus rule that we just made. I don't need to specify solid or 1 pixel anymore. I'll just change this back to border color. And now the jump isn't going to exist. You can see that my form fields don't have a border, but when I click inside of them, the color changes and the border appears. So I think that that looks much better for what we're trying to do with the focus. The next thing that we're going to look at right here is our submit button. Because the submit button is actually an input field as well, you can see it's an input with a type of submit. It's inheriting some of the rules that we just made. I do want to keep some of these, but I'm going to change the color slightly, and we'll also change the padding. And I think it would be nice to have the submit button change to a pointer so that it looks more like a button. So we'll style that with our CSS as well. My selector this time is going to be form input, and then we're going to use the attribute selector, and I'll change the attribute to the submit type. Here I'm going to specify a background color, and I'm just going to use a straight hex value. This is a little darker color of green teal that we're using. I'm going to set my width to auto. My padding is going to be 5 pixels for the top and the bottom, but we'll change the padding on the right and the left to 20 pixels. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to change my cursor to be the pointer. Now when we save and we look at our submit button, you can see that it's slightly larger, a little bit darker color green, and when I hover over, I get the pointer. Let's actually give the submit button a hover state as well. So we'll go ahead and we'll use our attribute selector for submit, and then after the closing square bracket, I'm going to use hover. This will allow me to access the hover state. I'm going to change the border color at the hover state. So again, I only need to use border color, and that's because we defined the border as solid in 1 pixel, and here we're defining the color up above. So here I'm going to use this same kind of dark teal border color when the submit button is hovered over, and we'll change the background color to be a little bit of a lighter color green. So I'm going to use my RGBA, and we'll pass on the same values that we're using elsewhere. Now when I refresh and I hover over, you can see that I get something that looks more like a traditional link type of button. Now my form is coming together and it's starting to look pretty good. The next thing that I want to do though is at a wide screen, I'm going to have this be in a 2-column layout. So I actually want to grab this whole section of my form and have it appear over here to the right. Currently, these are just going to be stacked. And I don't mind this type of layout at the small screen, but at the large screen, there's too much open space over here to the right. In order to get this to be in a 2-column layout, at the larger screen, I'm going to come into my media query. We already have the media query started, and we're going to make a rule for .form call. I'm going to float on the left. I'm going to set the width of each of the form columns to be 50%, and we're going to eliminate the border on the bottom. We only want that to be present at the smaller screen. If I save now and we refresh, you can see that I have more of a 2-column layout. This is what I'm looking for right now. If I resize my screen, you can see that at the breakpoint it changes to a 1-column layout, and this is looking pretty good. So what we covered here was now you know how to customize the form focus properties. Being able to style the focus states of your form elements to better match the colors of your web design is going to give your websites more polish.